I'm your host, Chelsea, and it's Frightful Friday. Ooh. Thanks for joining us for another Frightful Friday. This is where we discuss Midwestern lore, urban legends, some true crime, cryptids, some fun stuff, because there's like 12 states that surround the Midwest. On today's Frightful Friday, we are going to be doing a true crime. So I've picked two cases that are unsolved. I haven't heard of them, and I thought they were pretty interesting because there were some suspects as well as some like jail time, but then some were acquitted. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I've always loved true crime. It's something that is always intriguing. And I think all of us have that, with all the known serial killers. You've got, Ted Bundy and BTK, Dennis Rader, the Night Stalker, all of them. Everyone knows who they are. Okay. I also enjoy the unsolved ones, listening to them, because that's so wild to me that people either vanish without a trace or people get murdered and killed and there's just no evidence tying to them. Like, that is absolutely terrifying, knowing that there are people out there like that and it happens. It's true. So let's get into the episodes today. We will be discussing the Springfield Three, based in Springfield, Missouri, and then the Iowa Villisca murders, the axe murders. So, let's get it going. Buckle up. Okay, the first one we're going to discuss is the Springfield Three. The Springfield Three refers to an unsolved missing persons case that began on June 7th, 1992, when Suzanne Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall and Streeter's mother, Cheryl Levitt, went missing from Levitt's home in Springfield, Missouri. All of their personal belongings, including cars and purses, were left behind. There were no signs of a struggle except a broken porch-like globe. There was also a message on the answering machine that police believed might have provided a clue about the disappearances, but it was inadvertently erased. So this is, I'm 30, so it's 32 years old, and it's still unsolved to this day. They've been missing for 32 years, 7 months, and 18 days. In 1997, Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and robber, claimed that he knew the women had been murdered and that their bodies would never be recovered. Neither their whereabouts nor their remains have ever been discovered. No investigators in the case believe Cox has any credibility. So let's get into the victims. Cheryl Elizabeth Levitt was 47 years old at the time of her disappearance. She was 5 foot 0 inches, around 110 pounds, with short, light blonde hair, brown eyes, and pierced ears. She was a cosmetologist at a local salon and was a single mother, reportedly very close to her daughter, Suzanne Elizabeth Susie Streeter. Streeter was 19 years old and 5 foot 2 inches, 102 pounds, with shoulder-length blonde hair and brown eyes. Her distinguishable marks included a scar on her upper right forearm and a small mole on her left corner of her mouth, and pierced ears, her left ear pierced twice. Stacy Kathleen McCall was 18 years old, was 5 feet 3 inches, and 120 pounds, with long, dark blonde hair and light-colored eyes. So, of course, whenever you go down the rabbit hole of true crime, you look up photos. And these three women were beautiful. They were gorgeous girls, and they seemed to have bright futures ahead of them. I find this stuff to be really, really sad. Disappearance. Streeter and McCall graduated from Kickapoo High School on June 6, 1992, at the Hammond Student Center on Missouri State University's campus. Levitt was in in attendance at the arena witnessing her daughter graduate that evening. The girls, Streeter and McCall, were last seen at around 2 a.m. on June 7th when they were leaving the last few graduation parties they had attended that evening. They began partying that night with their friend Janelle Kirby in Battlefield before carpooling to other parties in Springfield. Their last party at the residence of McCall's friend's house, Michelle Elder, was broken up by Springfield police at 1:58 a.m. before the trio of girls returned to Kirby's house in Battlefield around 2 a.m. Elder stated at her party that she and McCall wanted to rekindle their friendship, so the pair had made plans for the evening of Sunday, June 8th. The original trio of girls planned to spend the night at Kirby's house, but after realizing her house was too crowded with out-of-town relatives for her graduation, Streeter and McCall decided to go to the Levitt's home at 1717 East Delmar to retire for the night. Streeter was excited to show McCall her new king-sized waterbed she had recently had delivered. You guys remember those? I think my parents had one. Both Streeter and McCall planned to meet Kirby and other friends at the Branson Water Park, Whitewater, the next morning. Kirby's mother, Kathy, told Springfield police she overheard the pair leaving while in bed. Streeter allegedly told McCall to follow me to my house, to which McCall replied, "Okay, I will." It is assumed they arrived at the Delmar residence because their clothing, jewelry, purses, and vehicles were all present at the house the next day. Levitt was last heard from at approximately 11:15 p.m. on June 6 when she spoke with a friend on the phone about painting and varnishing an armoire in her bedroom. The following day around 9 a.m., Kirby and her boyfriend, Mike Henson, visited the house after Streeter and McCall failed to show up at her home. They had planned to spend the day at Whitewater and were supposed to leave from Kirby's residence. Upon arriving, Kirby found the home's front door unlocked and entered, but found no sign of Streeter, McCall, or Levitt. Each of the woman's cars were parked outside. She also reported to police that the glass lampshade on the porch light was shattered, though the light bulb itself was intact. Henson innocently helped Kirby sweep the broken glass off the porch, which police later determined may have destroyed potential evidence. Henson stated he did this because Kirby was barefooted. Nigel Kinney, a coworker and close friend of Streeter's, stated she was a creature of habit and very particular about parking her vehicle in the same spot of the resident's driveway. Kinney believes that because Streeter's car was not in the carport as usual, someone else could have possibly parked in her spot when she and McCall arrived before dawn on June 7th. Inside the house, Kirby found Levitt and Streeter's dog, a Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, who appeared agitated. As they were leaving the residence, Kirby answered a strange and disturbing call from an unidentified male who made sexual innuendos. She hung up and immediately received another call of a sexual nature, again hanging up the phone. The phone calls were jarring, but she remembered Streeter complaining about prank calls at the residence since moving in with Levitt in the spring of 1992. According to Springfield Police Department's David Asher, the calls were obscene. The individual would not identify himself. They were using the F word and several other words, and she just hung up the phone. Kirby described the caller as teenish. With no sign of Streeter or McCall, Kirby and Henson decided to visit the local water park, Hydroslide, now defunct, in Springfield instead of Whitewater in Branson. Several hours later, McCall's mother, Janice, also visited the house as her daughter failed to answer her calls all day. Janice had friends who knew employees of Whitewater and became panicked after they confirmed Streeter and McCall had not been seen there. Inside the Delmar residence, the family dog Cinnamon comes barreling towards her. She notices all three women's purses were sitting on the floor of Streeter's bedroom. Levitt's purse still contained a cash deposit of over $800 from her work at the salon. Janice also saw her daughter's clothing neatly folded from the night before in the bedroom as well. the only clothes McCall had possession of that night. There were recently used makeup wipes of Streeter and McCall found along with their jewelry and keys. Levitt and Streeter's cigarettes were left inside the house, which was considered unusual of Levitt's friends and family, who described her as a chain smoker. An unfinished can of Coke was also found next to Streeter's pack of cigarettes. The lights were off in Streeter's room, and her television was showing snow. You know, the black and white noise, that kind of stuff, suggesting they had just watched a movie that night, but never turned off the television after it was finished. Janice frantically called the police from the home's telephone to report the 3 women missing. After placing the call, while checking the phone's answering machine, she listened to a strange message, but it was inadvertently erased, as that was common for most voicemails in the 90s after being played once. Police were very interested in the call and believed it may have contained a clue. They also did not believe it was connected to the prank calls Kirby received. McCall's parents contacted police in reference to their daughter's disappearance from Levitt's home more than 16 hours after the women were last seen, and the other worried friends and family called and visited the house the following day. Police estimated that the crime scene had been corrupted by 10 to 20 people who visited Levitt's house. Upon the officers' arrival, the scene showed no signs of a struggle except for the shattered porch light. Police also noted Levitt's bed had looked slept in and awkwardly bent, and there was an awkwardly bent window blind. All personal property was left behind, including purses, money, cars, keys, cigarettes, and the family dog Cinnamon, who was most likely the only witness of the women's disappearance. Levitt had a doctor's appointment scheduled Monday, June 8th, 1992. McCall was scheduled to work that day as well, and Streeter was scheduled to work on Tuesday, June 9th at 4 p.m. None of the women would arrive for these dates. On December 31st, 1992, a man called the America's Most Wanted hotline with information about the women's disappearances, but the call was disconnected when the switchboard operator attempted to link up with Springfield investigators. Police said the caller had prime knowledge of the abductions and publicly appealed for the man to contact them, but he never did. Levitt and Streeter were declared legally dead in 1997. However, their case files are still officially filed under missing. Investigators received a tip that the women's bodies were buried in the foundations of the south parking garage at Cox Hospital. In 2007, crime reporter Kathy Bard invited Rick Norland, a mechanical engineer, to scan a corner of the parking garage with ground-penetrating radar, GPR. Norland found 3 anomalies roughly the same size that he said were consistent with a grave site location. 2 of the anomalies were parallel and the other was perpendicular. Springfield Police Department spokesperson Lisa Cox said the person who reported the tip provided no evidence or logical reasoning behind this theory at that time or since then. She also said the parking garage began construction in September of 1993, over a year after the disappearances. Digging up the area and subsequently reconstructing this structure would be extremely costly, and without any reasonable belief that the bodies could be located here, it is illogical to do so, and for those reasons, Springfield PD does not intend to. Investigators have determined this lead to not be credible. Daryl Moore, a former assistant at the Greene County Prosecutor's Attorney's Office, said the tip came from someone who either claimed to be a psychic or claimed to have a dream or vision about the case. Suspects. Dustin Recklow was a former boyfriend of Susie Streeter. He broke into a Springfield mausoleum a few months before the women vanished and stole $30 worth of gold fillings from a skull. Police looked at Recklow because Streeter had given investigators a statement about the mausoleum break-in and was rumored to be a probable witness against Recklow in court. Dustin and his 2 friends that helped in the robbery were known to be together and in the area the night the women went missing. In 1997, Robert Craig Cox, imprisoned in Texas as a convicted kidnapper and robber and the suspect in a Florida murder, told journalists that he knew the three women had been murdered and buried and claimed their bodies would never be recovered. In 1992, Cox had been living in Springfield and, when interviewed then, had told investigators that he was with his girlfriend at church the morning after the women disappeared, which she corroborated. However, she later recanted her statement and said that Cox had asked her to say that. Cox also stated that he was at the home of his parents the night of the disappearance, and they confirmed that alibi. Authorities were uncertain if Cox was involved in the case or if he was seeking recognition for the alleged murders by issuing false statements. He later stated to authorities and journalists he would disclose what happened to the three women after his mother died. The case remains unsolved as of 2024 in spite of upwards of 5,000 tips from the public. In June 1997, a bench was dedicated to the women inside the victims' memorial garden in Springfield's Phelps Grove Park. The case has been featured on shows such as 48 Hours and America's Most Wanted. Investigation Discovery, ID, aired the Springfield Three on its disappeared TV series. In 2019, the same channel's People magazine Investigates featured a tabloid-style episode titled The Springfield Three. In 2021, journalist Anne Roderick Jones launched The Springfield Three, a small-town disappearance podcast. That's really sad. Whenever you think about it, is that, this was a mother and her daughter and then a friend, and, these girls just had their whole lives ahead of them and just vanished. One thing I absolutely hate is whenever, and I get it, it reminds me of the JonBenet Ramsey case, people don't think about evidence or, the home being the main, crime scene. They just want to comfort people. But, he didn't mean to, sweep up the glass. He wasn't thinking, Kirby was barefoot. They were just checking on their friends, seeing what was going on, and letting people in the home. I don't know. That just really sucks because there could have been. Well, nowadays though, if they can go back and go through fingerprints and stuff, they can cancel out the people that were in that house. They only said there was 10 to 20 people in there. So if they can get all their DNA and all their fingerprints, they should be able to narrow down, if there's any mystery prints and stuff there, right? So I don't know. I think that's crazy. I know lately we've heard a lot about human trafficking and stuff. And I don't know, I hope maybe we'll get some results in the near future. Maybe someone will fess up or we'll get some more DNA found. So that was the Springfield Three. They are still listed on the FBI's page. They even have a possible what they could look like now. So Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall. Yeah, that's just really sad. Let's get into the next unsolved case. The Villisca axe murders occurred between the evening and early morning of June 9th through 10th in 1912 in the town of Villisca, Iowa. The 6 members of the Moore family and 2 guests were found bludgeoned in the Moore residence. All 8 victims, including 6 children, had severe head wounds from an axe. A lengthy investigation yielded several suspects, one of whom was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and the second ended in an acquittal. The victims consisted of parents Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur Boyd, and Paul They were between the ages of, so Josiah and Sarah were 43 and 39, and the children ranged from age 11, 10, 7, and 5. The Moores were well known and well liked in their community, and on June 9th, 1912, Mary Catherine Moore invited Ina May, 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, 12, to spend the night at the Moore's home. That evening, the visiting girls and the Moore family attended the Presbyterian church where they participated in the Children's Day program, which Sarah had coordinated. After the program ended at 9:30 p.m., the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked to the Moore's house, arriving between 9:45 and 10 p.m. At 7 a.m. the next day, June 10th, Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, became concerned after she noticed that the family had not come out to do their morning chores. Peckham knocked on the Moore's door. When nobody answered, she tried to open the door and discovered that it was locked. Peckham let the Moore's chickens out and called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Like Peckham, Moore received no response when he knocked on the door and shouted. Ross unlocked the front door with his copy of the house key. While Peckham stood on the porch, Ross went into the parlor and opened the guest bedroom door, where he found Ina and Lena Stillinger's body on the bed. Moore immediately told Peckham to call Henry Hank Horton, Villisca's primary peace officer, who arrived shortly thereafter. Horton's search of the house revealed that the entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah, was found in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters were found. Doctors concluded that the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. 2 spent cigarettes in the attic suggested that the killer or killers patiently waited in the attic until the Moore family and the Stillinger guests were asleep. The killer began in the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah Moore were sleeping. Josiah received more blows from the axe than any other victim. His face had been cut to such an extent that his eyes were completely destroyed. The ceiling in his room also had a gouge mark from when the murderer lifted the axe to murder him. The killer or killers used the blade on the axe on Sarah while using the blunt end on the rest of the victims. Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, Paul were next bludgeoned in the head in the same manner as their parents. Afterwards, the murderer returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows on the elder Moores, knocking over a shoe that had filled with blood from the previous attack, before moving downstairs to the guest bedroom, killing Ina and Lena. Seemingly afterwards, a 4-pound slab of bacon was taken out of the icebox and laid next to the axe. Investigators also found untouched food and bloody water on the kitchen table during the search. Investigators believed that all of the victims, except for Lena Stillinger, had been asleep when murdered. They thought she was awake and tried to fight back as she was found lying crosswise on her bed and with a defensive wound on her arm. Trigger warning. Lena's body had also been moved and her undergarments removed. Her leg had been positioned so to reveal her genitalia. This led to law enforcement speculation that the killer or killers molested her or attempted to do so. Later investigations showed no evidence of this. In another bizarre twist, every mirror in the house was covered with blankets, clothing, or any means of covering. Garments were removed from the dressers to cover the mirrors. That's kind of weird. After the search of the house, people were let into the home to view the scene. At around 8:40 a.m., the town's central telephone center issued an all-call alert advising every household in the town of the murders. Within minutes, the house was rushed by townsfolk. This completely contaminated the scene. Even some people stole pieces of Josiah's skull as souvenirs. The murder weapon was handled by hundreds that came through the house. The sheriff was unable to gain control of the scene for hours. The county coroner, Dr. Lindquist, arrived at the scene of the crime at approximately 9 a.m. After viewing the scene himself, he later met with Horton, who had been the town's night watchman that Sunday, and Sheriff Orrin Jackson to review the information they had collected. Lindquist was upset by the constant influx of townsfolk interfering with the investigation and urged the sheriff to get the National Guard to secure the scene. By 10:30 a.m., the National Guard had established a secure perimeter to keep people out. A local druggist, whose hobby was photography, showed up to take photos, but he was dismissed, told taking photos was too ghoulish, although he may have had an economic motive. Many drugstores sold postcards of crime scenes at that time. Although Lindquist called members of the coroner's jury together in the late afternoon, it was several hours later before they entered the Moore home to view the bodies. After 10 p.m., he called the county attorney Ratcliffe to give permission to the undertaker to remove them. The fire station had been set up as a temporary morgue, and it was close to 2 a.m. before all the bodies had been transported there, likely around 24 hours after the actual murders occurred. Based on initial estimates, doctors estimated the murders occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. The victims' autopsies revealed all died from severe head injuries. Some wondered how a murderer could maneuver in a compact, creaking farmhouse without awaking anyone. At the time, newspapers offered a theory the murderer put a sedative in milk or cocoa, but toxicology studies weren't a routine part of autopsies at that time. In the barn, investigators found an imprint in the hay in the barn next to a knothole, where they believe the killer observed the family for some time. 2 spent cigarettes found in the attic suggested the murderer could have entered the house via a window or unlocked back door and hid until the family returned from church. 2 curious bits of evidence were uncovered: a gas lamp with its glass chimney removed and its wick turned down so it would give off only the faintest bit of light was discovered upstairs. A fragment of a keychain not belonging to the Moores was found downstairs. After this limited investigation, coroner held an inquest the next day, June 11, 1912, where 13 people were interviewed as potential witnesses. Over time, many possible suspects emerged, including Reverend George Kelly, Frank F. Jones, William Mansfield, Loving Mitchell, Paul Mueller, and Henry Lee Moore, no relation. Kelly was tried twice for the murder. The first trial ended in a hung jury, while the second ended in an acquittal. Other suspects in the investigation were also exonerated. Andrew Sawyer. Every transient and otherwise unaccounted for stranger was a suspect in the murders. Andrew Sawyer was one of those people. He was interrogated but not charged. He also was obsessed with the murders and slept fully clothed as if he was ready to make a clean getaway, and he also slept with an axe by his bed. Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister in the town on the night of the murders. Kelly was described as peculiar, reportedly having suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent. As an adult, he was accused of peeping and several times asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. On June 8, 1912, he came to Villisca to teach at the Children's Day services, which the Moore family attended on June 9, 1912. He left town between 5 a.m. and 5:50 a.m. on June 10th, hours before the bodies were discovered. Reverend Kelly had confessed to the murders in court, but the jury did not believe his confession. In the weeks that followed, he displayed a fascination with the case and wrote many letters to the police, investigators, and family of the deceased. This aroused suspicion, and a private investigator wrote back to Reverend Kelly asking for details that the minister might know about the murders. Kelly replied with great detail, claiming to have heard sounds and possibly witnessed the murders. His known mental illness made authorities question whether he knew the details because of having committed the murders or was imagining his account. In 1914, 2 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. He was sexually harassing a woman who applied for a job as his secretary. He was sent to St. Elizabeth Hospital and the National Mental Hospital, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. Investigators speculated again that Kelly could be the murderer of the Moore family. In 1917, Kelly was arrested for the Villisca murders. Police obtained a confession from him. However, it followed many hours of interrogation, and Kelly later recanted. After 2 separate trials, he was acquitted. Frank F. Jones. Frank Fernando Jones was a Villisca resident and an Iowa state senator. Josiah Moore had worked for Frank Jones at his implement store for many years before leaving to open his own store. Moore reportedly took business away from Jones, including a very successful John Deere dealership. Moore was rumored to have had a sexual affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though no evidence supports this. William Mansfield. Another theory was that Senator Jones hired William Insane Blackie Mansfield, an ex-convict and former U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Leavenworth, to murder the Moore family. 9 months before the murders at Villisca, a similar case of axe murder occurred in Colorado Springs, Colorado. 2 axe murder cases followed in Ellsworth, Kansas, and Paulo, Kansas. The cases were similar enough to raise the possibility of having been committed by the same person. Other murders reported as possibly being linked to these crimes included numerous unsolved axe murders along the South Pacific Railroad from 1911 to 1912, the unsolved axemen of New Orleans killings, as well as several other such murders during this time period. The murders in Colorado Springs were closely related in execution to those in the Moore house. H.C. Wayne, his wife and child, and Mrs. A.J. Burnham were found dead and murdered with an axe. Bed sheets were used to cover the windows to prevent passerbys from looking in. At the Moore house, the murderer hung aprons and skirts to cover the windows. As in the murders in Villisca, the murderer in Colorado Springs wiped the blood off the axe and covered the heads of the victims with bedclothes. Mansfield was also the prime suspect of the Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City and Detective James Newton Wilkerson, who suggested that he was a cocaine-addicted serial killer. According to contemporary news reports, Wilkerson believed Mansfield was responsible for the axe murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, on July 15, 1914, 2 years after the Villisca murders. The axe murders committed in Paulo, Kansas, 4 days before Villisca murders, and the murders of Jenny Peterson and Jenny Miller in Aurora, Illinois. According to Wilkerson's investigation, all of the murders were committed in precisely the same manner, indicating that the same man probably committed them. Wilkerson stated that he could prove that Mansfield was present in each of the differing crime scenes on the night of the murders. In each murder, the victims were hacked to death with an axe, and the mirrors in the homes were covered. A burning lamp with the chimney off was left at the foot of the bed, and a basin in which the murderer washed was found in the kitchen. In each case, the murderer avoided leaving fingerprints by wearing gloves, which Wilkerson believed was strong evidence that the man was Mansfield, who knew his fingerprints were on file at the federal military prison at Leavenworth. Wilkerson managed to convince a grand jury to open an investigation in 1916, and Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County from Kansas City. Payroll records, however, provided an alibi that placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. He was released for a lack of evidence and later won a lawsuit he brought against Wilkerson and was awarded $2,225. Wilkerson believed that the pressure from Jones resulted not only in Mansfield's release, but also in the subsequent arrest and trial of Reverend Kelly. However, R.H. Thrope, a restaurant owner from Shenandoah, Iowa, identified Mansfield as the man he saw the morning after the Villisca murders boarding a train to Clarinda. This man said he had walked from Villisca. If proven to be true, this testimony would disprove Mansfield's alibi. Furthermore, it was reported that a Mrs. Vina Tompkins of Marshalltown was on her way to testify that she heard 3 men in the woods plotting the murder of the Moore family a short time before the killings. Henry Lee Moore. Henry Lee Moore was a suspected serial killer, and he's not related to the Moore family, who was convicted of the murder of his mother and grandmother several months after the murders in Villisca, his weapon of choice being an axe. Before and after the murders in Villisca, the very similar axe murders of his mother and grandmother were committed, and all of the cases showed striking similarities, leading to strong suspicion that some of the crimes were committed by an axe-murdering serial killer, and just like Blackie Mansfield, the axe-murdering Henry Moore can also be considered a suspect in some of these slayings. Samuel R. Moyer. At an inquest, it was reported that Samuel Ronald Moyer, Josiah's brother-in-law, often threatened to kill Josiah Moore. However, upon further investigation, Moyer's alibi cleared him of the crime. Paul Mueller. In their 2017 book, The Man from the Train, Bill James, and his daughter Rachel McCarthy, James discusses the Villisca murders as part of a much larger series of murders which they believe were all committed by a single serial killer. They concluded the murderer was Paul Mueller, or Miller, an immigrant possibly from Germany who was the subject of an unsuccessful year-long manhunt as the sole suspect in the 1897 murder of a family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, who had employed him as a farmhand. James started his research in an attempt to solve the Villisca murders, and with his daughters found archival newspaper stories detailing dozens of families murdered under similar circumstances across the U.S. The Jameses thus believed that Mueller was guilty of the Villisca murders as part of a killing spree that lasted over a decade, killing at least 59 people in 14 separate incidents, including Colorado Springs and Palo crimes. The Jameses identified common features to these crimes, many of which were also found at the Villisca scene. The killer selected families who lived near railroad tracks, which is how the killer was suspected to have traveled. Seemingly stuck in the ambush at about midnight while the victims were asleep, he would use the blunt side of an axe rather than the blade to strike the victims in the head and face, used an axe found at the victim's home and left in plain sight after the murders, covered the victims with blankets to prevent blood splatter, covered windows from inside the house, and locked the doors before departure. In Mueller's suspected crimes, there was often, but not always, a sexual motive directed towards a pubescent girl, as with Lena being partly disrobed. In a blurb on the dust jacket of the hardcover edition of The Man from the Train, Professor and crime writer Harold Schechter writes that James's offered the most probable solution for the Villisca murders. That's crazy that they have all of these suspects and yet it is still unsolved. That's wild. Today, the house is a tourist destination in the small rural Iowa town of Villisca. A couple had purchased the home in 1995 and undone all the modern renovations to the house, restoring it to the 1912 condition. The couple now offers tours and overnight stays in the house. Its selling point is that the house is now haunted because of the events that occurred in it. That's crazy. So we have a 1912 case and a 1992 case where people just waltz on into the house and disrupt evidence. I mean, that's crazy. But dude, the 1900s were a wild time. It's so crazy that people came in and would take pieces of the father's skull, like as souvenirs, and then people would buy postcards of the crime scenes. Like, what a wild fucking time, dude. That's crazy. Well, I'm sad now because, these crimes were unsolved. That's just heartbreaking, especially, the Springfield Three. And those always, I guess, fascinate me that people just get up and vanish like that. Missing person cases are probably the saddest things ever because you don't ever get closure. And I really hope that soon, I know I said this earlier, but I really hope soon that, there'll be a break in the case and maybe someone will come forward or find more evidence. So I will link in the show notes, the link to the America's Most Wanted and the FBI. So if you know anyone or if you hear anything, look, dude, if you hear something, say something like that. If you hear some off the wall shit that you feel raises some red flags, speak up. It does not hurt to call it in. That's what investigators are there for. It's what the police are there for. So this was our Frightful Friday. Hope you guys feel that sense of dread that I feel right now. I feel kind of sad and icky. I didn't want to really, I guess, be my normal self because these are not laughing matters. This is some serious stuff that I understand. The 1912 case, we may never, ever get the answers from that. I mean, there were some really good possible suspects, but I'm sure they're all long gone now. But the Springfield Three, I mean, that kind of hits close to home. That's crazy. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. And again, send in your request to me. What do we want to do next Friday? Do we want to do an urban legend? Do we want to do cryptids again? Or no, I think we did urban legends. Yeah, we did urban legends last time. I don't know. I'll do some research if you guys don't send anything in or comment below. Bye, guys. Don't forget to go back to the Movie Monday episode, The Boogeyman. I have a poll in the show notes. Pick one of those three. It is between House of Wax, The Faculty, and Jeepers Creepers 2. Place your votes. Thank you so much for listening. Follow me on Spotify and YouTube. Leave any comments, like, subscribe. I even have a Patreon set up. Send me an email with any requests or stories at midwestfrightpodcast@gmail.com. Talk to you soon. Bye.